Good afternoon, all researchers, innovators, for joining us for this session today on how to get your research published in a peer-reviewed journal. My name is Susanne Ranzovaso. I'm the regional representative of Euraxis ASEAN. And of course, you're joining us for the European Research Days Indonesia 2020, this year, of course, in a virtual format. So we hope you're not tired yet of seeing us online, because today is really an excellent session. This is the only one, I think, where you really need to pay attention to make sure that your research gets visibility to make you more employable. Now, before I hand over to our absolute top-notch expert speaker today, I want to just say a few words about Euraxis, just to allow you to plan your research career with the help of Euraxis. Now, Euraxis is a pan-European project. It is supported by the European Commission, and most importantly, there are 42 European countries that are part of this growing network of researchers and research countries. So what this project does is to provide you with all the information and the support that you as a researcher here in Indonesia or anywhere else in Southeast Asia need if you want to spend part of your research career in Europe, or if you're looking to establish collaborations with European partners. The key element to this, and I know this is of most important to many of you, is our job and funding portal, and you will find thousands of opportunities on that portal: PhD openings, postdoctoral openings, senior research positions, short-term attachments in all of these 42 European countries, plus beyond, because Euraxis is not only a European initiative, we have Euraxis worldwide. I am part of Euraxis Southeast Asia, so our job is also to link all these research partners across the globe, and you will find information on them also on our portal. As I said, Euraxis is a growing network of actual researchers. And what we have for you is a partnering tool. So this is an opportunity for you to identify researchers in your field that are based somewhere else in Europe or other parts of the world. Maybe you want to reach out to universities or maybe to companies that are carrying out research to establish your network. On our hosting database, you will find concrete offers from supervisors and institutions across Europe that are offering placements. So for example, when the Marie Curie Individual Fellowship Call is open again next April, you will find lots of hosting offers coming into the database where universities in Europe are looking to work with international researchers to come and spend some time in Europe and do their postdoc research with them. We have a lot of information for you, of course, everything you need to know about living in Europe, working in Europe, getting access to Europe, which right now I know is a key issue with the COVID situation. What are the immigration rules that you need to know? And more importantly, we have this huge network of service centers. So for example, you have identified a research opportunity in Sweden where our speaker is based, and you would like to get some advice on how to go about entering Sweden, or how to find funding for your research there, or maybe what you need to know about your spouse that might be accompanying you, then this would be a first call for you to get support. As I said, I'm part of Euraxis ASEAN. I'm based in Singapore. I'm also in charge of Indonesia and Malaysia. And you can always get in touch with me if you need some assistance. Please scan the handy QR code that I've created here. That will lead you directly to our website. And there you will find lots and lots of information about our activities here in Southeast Asia, especially for you, our research community. And of course, we're right in the middle of the European Research Days 2020. There's more activities coming up, but also you will find all the recordings and all the slides of the other sessions, in case you haven't had time to attend them, on the website, so you can make the most of this information for your own career development. Now I'll finish with this, and I want to, of course, introduce you now to our speaker. Our speaker today is Victoria Babbit. She is the Director of Researcher Development and Outreach with Taylor and Francis, and I'm sure you are all familiar with Taylor and Francis. She joined Taylor and Francis in 2008, and throughout the past decade, she has supported societies, editors, and authors as they navigate the very rapidly changing publishing landscape. She is an absolute star. She's worked with all our colleagues across the Euraccess Worldwide Network. Now, her work involves engaging with global researcher communities to build knowledge and capacity related to publishing and editorial activities. Now, Victoria herself is a researcher by training. She pursued a PhD in geography, focusing on migration at the University of Washington in Seattle, and she is joining us today from Sweden. And with this, Victoria, I will make you the presenter of this session so that you can share your slides and start your presentation.
Great. Let me see. Just have to choose the right screen here. Are you able to see my screen?
We can see your screen, and before you start, just a comment to our audience today, you can ask your questions via the question box on the right-hand side. We'll have a Q&A at the end where you can ask a question, and Victoria, of course, will answer them. And with this, please, Victoria, the floor is yours.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining this session this afternoon on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate it. This session today is going to take a look at the basic things that you need to think about as an author when considering where to publish and the process that you will follow in publishing. So as said, if you want to put questions in the box as we go along, I'll try my best to answer all of them after I'm finished speaking. And just to say, you're going to hear a little bit of a crackling of a fire here on the side, so I hope that's not too distracting. Right, so let's begin today by looking at the publishing landscape. So there are about 10,000 publishers worldwide, with around 5,000 of those indexed in Scopus. And those publishers are publishing around 33,000 plus active English language peer-reviewed journals, with a further 9,400, 9,500 non-English language peer-reviewed journals. And this number traditionally grows by about 3.5% year on year. Now, these journals are publishing over 3 million articles per year, which is, to me, an incredible number. And that number traditionally grows by about 3% year on year. However, those numbers are increasing in recent years. So now we see about a growth of 5% of journals year on year, so new journals, and about 4% growth in published articles. And much of this growth is due to research and development investment on the parts of governments worldwide. And that investment is supporting anywhere between 7 and actually 9 million researchers. This data is a couple years old, depending on how you define researcher. Now, what I find interesting about all this data is of those researchers, only about 20% publish more than one time. Irrespective, as you can see, this is a very, very active landscape, and it's important to think through your research and publishing strategies if you'd like to make an impact in this landscape. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And before you begin investigating possible journal options, it's essential that you spend time understanding your project and the audience you hope to reach. And throughout your career, you will likely be involved in many different research projects, producing a variety of content. And typically, people focus solely on the research article, But you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature review or a theory review, or maybe a systemic review. You may be interested in publishing a position piece or a case study. You might think about publishing book reviews, and actually that's a really great way to get involved in publishing as you're just kind of dipping your toe into it. So as a PhD student that has some expertise in a certain literature. Now, sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you might also choose to engage in public scholarship, so writing for the general public or policymakers, or you might want to focus particularly on practitioners in the field. So take time to determine your objectives. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember, you are joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So make sure that you are contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. Your contribution should be novel, and it should be pushing the discussion forward in some way. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I'm just going to go through a few of them here. So the first one is age. A well-established journal with a good reputation is always going to be a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research, or they may be using an interesting publishing model. The only thing I would recommend is, if it is a new journal, make sure to do your research ahead of time. It can be helpful to look at the history of a journal. Has it published key researchers, a key research in the field? Does it publish on time? Do they have a history of retractions or other problems? Affiliation may be important. Is it a journal of an important society or a, very well-established institution? Is it published by a trusted publishing house? And the scope of the journal. Every journal will have a particular scope, whether that's that it's interdisciplinary in nature, perhaps it's a niche journal, just looking at a very small subject area, or maybe it's interested in covering broad subject areas, so a generalist journal, or it could be a mega journal. All of this will be outlined really clearly in the aims and scope statement. Next is, who reads the journal? Is it going to be practitioners? Is it a global audience? And all that will, again, be easy to discern by looking at the journal website. Now, impact can be measured in a number of ways. Obviously, we always talk about the impact factor, and the importance of the impact factor crosses all disciplines. However, there are other metrics that you might consider when thinking about impact. You might think about the importance of that journal in your particular community. Is it a good source of teaching? Just make sure that you understand what's valued in your institution and in your field in terms of impact when thinking about that. Now, the editorial board will give an indication of what type of research they're interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of a journal. So if they're interested in receiving, content in a new kind of emergent area, they will try and find an editorial board member who's a specialist in that area, who can act as an ambassador for the journal and help to run the peer review process in that area, because they will know all the key researchers in the field. Likewise with geography, if the journal is interested in receiving more submissions from Indonesia, they might find a specialist that's based in Indonesia that again can act as an ambassador for the journal. So you can really find out a lot by just looking at that board, the editorial board. Now, publishing model is becoming increasingly important, and we're going to discuss open access a bit more in the future, so I'll just leave that there. And peer review style may be important to you. This information will always be included in the instructions for authors. Many journals post their rejection rate on their website. Not all do. And if they're not posting their rejection rate, which is going to give you an indication of the competition in the journal, you can look at some of these other factors and basically get a general sense of how competitive that journal might be. Still, even taking into consideration all these different characteristics, it can be quite challenging to find a journal that you would like to submit to. However, there are lots of tools out there to help. So at Taylor & Francis, we have what we call a journal suggester, which will match your abstract with potential journals based on their aims and scope statements. And this will provide you with a list of journals to investigate further. So basically what you do is you copy and paste your abstract into that box, and then a list of journals will come up. Now, our advice would be to select a number of journals that you feel would be a good fit for your current project. And once you select a few journals, rank them from top to bottom. Here's the #1 journal, the one I really want to get into, but here's my #2, here's my #3. And when it is time to submit your work, start at the top, submit to your #1 choice. And if for some reason they're not interested in publishing your work, you can just move down to #2, and so on and so forth until your work is accepted. Right, so I mentioned open access a minute ago, and many, if not most of you, will be aware of open access and open research more broadly. So what are the benefits of publishing in an open access journal or platform? Well, the main benefits are greater visibility, and with that, potentially greater impact, both within the research community and the broader public. And the access, visibility, and impact can spur innovation and collaboration. At Taylor & Francis, we have seen that open access articles typically receive substantially more citations. So we see an increase of about 32%. Greater readership with over six times as many downloads. And increasingly in many countries, regions, and institutions, open access has become a requirement, or at least strongly encouraged. But I'd like to take a step back and look at what we're talking about when we're talking about open access, what it actually entails. And there are two basic elements to open access. The first is making content freely available online, irrespective of where you're sitting in the world. And the second one is making content reusable by a third party. And I'll briefly discuss both of these elements. So there are many terms thrown around when talking about open access. You'll hear gold open access and green open access and bronze open access, diamond open access. There's many terms that people use to indicate different characteristics. But today I'm just going to focus on what we call gold open access. Gold open access essentially entails making the PDF, the version of record, freely available online. And there are two ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor & Francis, and most publishers, to be frank, either through publishing in a fully open access journal or in what we call a hybrid journal. So a fully open access journal publishes all of their content open access. So all of their content is freely available to anyone. And these journals aren't funded by subscriptions, which is the traditional way journals are funded. Instead, most charge what's called an APC, or an article publishing charge. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutional agreements. And in this case, either the authors don't have to pay the APC, or they may pay a reduced fee. And all of this information should be clearly outlined on the journal website under the instructions for authors. And keep in mind, many institutions, or if you've received funding, the funders and institutions might cover the charge. So just do some research around what your options are in terms of covering APCs. Now, hybrid open access is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that is subscription funded, and much of their content is not freely accessible unless you or your institution has a subscription. And these journals charge an APC to cover the publication costs for that open access article. However, many institutions and consortia also have agreements with publishers to cover those APC costs for the hybrid journals. So once again, take a look at what your options are if you're interested in publishing open access in terms of covering those fees, because you might have some institutional agreements or your funder might actually cover that fee. Right, the second element of open access is how your work can be used by others after publication. So if you publish your article in an open access format, you will be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. And some journals don't give you a choice of which type of license you can use. So it's important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. Let me just run through a few of the basic licenses here. So the first one is CC BY, and this license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute authorship and the original publication. So they can't claim it for their own. And this license, the CC BY license, tends to be the most common license you will come across in a fully open access journal. The second license that I wanted to highlight is CC BY NC, and NC stands for non-commercial. And here an author can use your work in any manner, but they cannot profit from it. So for instance, they can't include your article in a book that they will subsequently charge money for, or maybe a figure that you used in your article in a book that they will subsequently charge money for, unless they come directly to you to ask for permission. And then there's CC BY ND. Here, the author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in its original format. For instance, this would mean that they could not translate your work. Lastly, we have CC BY SA, and this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license. Important to be aware of when you're using other people's work as well. So if you're using somebody else's work that has a CC Creative Commons license on it, you need to be clear of what those options are. Now, with the rise of open access, we've seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or predatory journals. And I can imagine some of you have been contacted by some of these publishers and journals who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit to their journal. They often state the peer review process is unrealistically short, so they'll talk about days rather than weeks. And then their websites often are quite deceptive. They'll have incorrect or slightly misleading information. So they might try and clone a well-known journal's website, but they'll just slightly change the name of the journal. Or they'll say that they have a global impact factor. And just be aware, impact factors are only called that. They're just called impact factors, nothing else. Some other key characteristics of predatory journals is that they have hidden or unclear author fees. So that's why I said when a journal is charging an APC, all of that information should be clearly outlined on the journal website, as well as any information about waivers that you might be available to you and that sort of thing. This shouldn't come to you as a surprise at the end of the process. The journals tend to lack quality peer review of articles by experts in the field, and they tend to guarantee acceptance and or the promise of very, very fast publication. So they'll talk about a week or 48 hours. And for any of you that have published before, you know that is quite unrealistic. So if you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and or internationally, it's really important that you avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. However, there are many resources out there to help you make sound decisions about where you would like to publish. For instance, a key resource is Think, Check, Submit. And this is a cross-country initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. Think, Check, Submit can help you identify high-quality journals which would be appropriate for submitting your research. And they can protect you against fraud and from publishing malpractice. And basically what they have is a little toolkit filled with questions for you to ask yourself about the journal. But I would say that the best approach when you're considering a journal is to seek advice from respected colleagues who have a lot of experience publishing, and especially if they have a lot of experience publishing with open access journals. And your librarian community is also a great resource. Now, the next resource that I wanted to highlight is the DOAJ, and this is a database for open access journals. The journals in this database have been screened to ensure that they're legitimate. However, like many databases, there is an assessment period, so new journals that are legitimate might not be listed immediately. In those cases, you will need to make sure that they are published by a respected publisher. And here is where OWASPA can help. OWASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers who work with open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included in this organization. So if the journal that you are interested in publishing in, you're considering publishing in, is not included in the DOAJ, and their publisher is not a member of OWASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. And again, this is about open access journals. All right, so today we're not going to be doing a writing workshop, obviously. It's a little bit tricky to do in an hour. But I do have some simple guidance for you to consider while preparing your manuscript. And the first piece of advice I have for you is to think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and to enjoy your work. Depending on the size of a journal, editors can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. So you want to make sure yours stands out in a good way. And here's some basic tips to help you make your argument easy to read and to understand. The first is write first and edit later. This will help you to create a through line in your paper, that line, that narrative line that holds all the different pieces together. So it's just good to do a straightforward writing, and then you can go back and edit and maybe move things around and that sort of thing. The second one is simplicity is key, especially when you are dealing with complex problems and theories. So think about your sentence structure and your use of the passive voice. And when it comes to sentences, I usually recommend keeping them relatively short, so maybe 2.5 lines max, because I think people start to lose track of the idea once you're getting into your third line on a paper. And sentence passive voice in a sentence is quite common in method sections. It's hard to talk about methods in any other way than using the passive voice. But if you do use the passive voice, make sure to kind of mix it up a little bit. Again, you're just helping, you're trying to make it easy as possible for the reader to understand your arguments and the evidence that you're using. And the best way for achieving this is to create a clear and easy to follow structure to your paper. Now, irrespective of discipline, most academic papers follow this model. It is especially important that you create a strong introduction. So that's 2 to 3 pages that basically lays out the paper. Editors often read and assess the relevance of paper based on the introduction. So it should be well structured and articulate all the key elements. So an introduction should establish the research question or the problem you're exploring. It should provide a clear thesis or a clear argument, which is easy to find and understand. So make sure your argument stands out. You don't want to bury it in the midst of the third paragraph. It should be one of the most dominant things in that introduction. And then introduction should also provide a clear outline of the structure of the paper. So as I write here, a roadmap. It's a map of letting readers know what they can expect in the paper. It just helps them to follow along. Now that roadmap would be obviously your methods or your theory section, your results, your discussion, and your conclusion. And depending on your discipline, you might call these sections slightly different things, but it's the basic structure there. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that your role is that of a storyteller. You're telling the story of your research, the research that you have found really interesting. So it's up to you to give life to the exciting story of that research. So make sure to be brave and to be bold, but really think of yourself as a storyteller. Now, once you publish, you of course want people to be able to find and read your work. And this begins with the basics. The first elements of your article that potential readers will see, and that's the title and the abstract. Title styles and format can vary somewhat depending on subject area or individual writing style. However, there are some tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. The first is write the title after you've written the paper. Though if you're like me and kind of struggle with coming up with good titles, it's not a bad idea to have a piece of paper next to you while you're writing where you can kind of jot down ideas as they come to you that you can review after the paper's done. And titles should be relatively short and to the point. So around 16 words or fewer. I'm really focused on what the article is about. And in that title, make sure to include some of those essential terms, keywords from your paper. And make sure to avoid any jargon or abbreviations. You know, oftentimes we're so close to our research, we forget not everyone else understands the vocabulary in that field or understands all the abbreviations we've been working with. So make sure to just keep those in the paper where you can unpack them and explain them. The title should be really straightforward. And make sure that title captures the subject of your paper and stands out, either for its clarity or for its creativity, if appropriate. Abstracts. So why are abstracts important? Well, an abstract should tell the reader what the article is about. They're like mini film trailers. They should give a sense of what the story is without providing all the details. So more like a mysterious French film trailer rather than an American film trailer where you never have to go to the film because they've showed you everything. You want people to click through and actually read the article. And here are some basic tips. First of all, similar with the title, it is difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish the paper, as the abstract is an overview of all the content. Make sure when you're getting ready to write your abstract that you understand the parameters for the particular journal you're submitting to. Most journals have word counts for their abstracts, and some have very specific guidance on format and structure. So go to the instructions for authors and take a look at what they're recommending. And think about who your potential audience is and write it for them. So I mentioned that earlier when thinking about your paper, but it's really important in your abstract as well. If you're writing for a practitioner, you might be using slightly different language than if you're writing for somebody who is deeply embedded in that research area that you're engaged in. And choose your language carefully. So like with the title, think about keywords and how someone might search for your work, and make sure to include those words in your abstract. And if your work is interdisciplinary, think about how other disciplines talk about that subject area, because they, again, might use slightly different language. And once you've done your first draft of your abstract, go through and remove any unnecessary words so that really you're just focusing on the essential information. Now, during the peer review process, you're going to revise your paper. And just remember, if you have revised your paper after you've written your abstract, you need to go back to that abstract and read it again and see if it still fits the paper. If it doesn't, then you need to revise it so that it does fit that new version of the paper. And lastly, read your abstract out loud and have others read it for fluency. A lot of people write their abstracts last minute and just kind of send them in. But if your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people are going to click through and read the article, because they're going to imagine that the article is going to be really difficult to read and understand as well. So do take the time to make sure it's well written. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight keywords. So along with the title and abstract, authors are often asked to provide some keywords that will be included in the metadata for their article. And the keywords in the title, in the abstract, and in the keyword category act as little flags in searches to help readers find your work. So make sure that you take the time to identify words or phrases that would be effective in searching for your work. And use synonyms if appropriate, as people might use slightly different words when searching for your work. And as I mentioned, if your work is interdisciplinary, that's very important. And when you're using your words and phrases, be specific so that you narrow down the amount of results that someone would get when they're searching. So I've used an example here. I've used homelessness, which if I type into Google here, I will receive a bunch of services for the homeless population in Stockholm, most likely. But if I put Swedish and policy on either side of that, then my results are going to become a bit more nuanced. I'll probably get some white papers. I'll probably get a list of NGOs, maybe some government agencies, maybe some academic papers. So just play around with your words a little bit. Put them into Google Scholar and Google and see what kind of results you get. Are they appropriate? Is it what you expected? Great. If not, go in and refine them a little bit until you do start to get the results that you would want. Right, so before we discuss the process further, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the ethical issues we see on a regular basis. And issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or it's possible that we're just getting a little bit better at identifying the breaches. So here are some of the issues we see on a regular basis, and I just need to note this is just a partial list, but we see authorship disputes, we see competing interests, duplicate submission, publication, data image fabrication and falsification, plagiarism and text recycling, peer review manipulation, and breaches of copyright. So we could do a whole session today, but I'm just going to focus on 3 issues that are quite common across disciplines, and that is authorship issues, duplicate submission and publication, and plagiarism and text recycling. So authorship disputes are quite common, and they tend to slow the peer review and production process down, because when an authorship dispute emerges, we as a publisher stop the process and say, you need to sort this out, either amongst yourselves or go to your institution to get some support. And then once you've sorted it out, you can come back to us with a written agreement that everyone has agreed to. So that takes a lot of time. And often the issues have to do with disagreements over who's included on the authorship line, the sequence of names, or who's responsible for different parts of the process. So to avoid any problems, it's extremely important that you have a written agreement between all of the authors regarding responsibilities, the sequence of names on the authorship line, and what journal you're submitting to. Now, apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we see. And the first is ghost authorship. And this is when a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made by someone without acknowledgement of their contribution. And this is an issue because we can't know if there's a conflict of interest, if we don't know all the people that were involved in writing the paper. The second one is guest authorship. And this is when authorship is granted to an individual who doesn't meet the ethical standards for authorship as we've outlined on this slide. And they're usually included on the authorship line because of their seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence. And this is common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they will be held responsible for it in the future. Now, next we have authorship for sale. And there have been a number of cases where individuals or more commonly recently, paper mills offer to add an author's name after a paper has been accepted for publication, but for a price. So these actors are preying on the desperation of scholars who clearly are under more and more pressure to publish more and more articles to progress in their careers. So it's something to keep an eye out for. Now, who qualifies as an author? I've listed a number of qualities on this slide, and I just want to note that all those qualities are linked by the word and, not by the word or. But the main takeaway here is any listed author is a representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study. So that means the rationale, the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation. Right, duplicate submission. I find this is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by. I know I was when I found out about it. The main takeaway here, before getting into all the details, is you may only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Now, why would it be a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? When you submit your paper to a journal for review, you are committing to publish in that journal. And they will use their time and their resources to review your paper and help you to improve it. And a really important thing to keep in mind is that there can only be one record. A published paper can only be published once. It's really easy to detect. Oftentimes the papers are sent to the same reviewer, so you might send the paper out to 2 different journals, but those editors are going to send it to the same reviewer. And then that reviewer usually comes back and alerts the 2 editors. And the process starts and stops at that point in time. And then we go back to the author and try and get some kind of clarification. Now, this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement between the roles and responsibilities between the authors. And hence, 2 co-authors accidentally submit the same paper to 2 different journals. But I have to say, editors are becoming less forgiving and will withdraw the papers oftentimes from peer review because they know that a few people are trying to game the system. Oh, we'll send it out to a bunch of people and see who's going to submit it first. And then we can say we didn't understand. So you have to be really careful about this. Absolutely avoid this. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about the previous presentation or publication or posting. Transparency is key in all of this. Now, for instance, if you've published an article in one language but would like to publish it in another language, you just need to contact the editor of the journal you would like to publish in and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so. And if you are taking that path where you want to publish a translation, remember to contact the original publisher as well to let them know that you are interested in publishing a translation, because there might be some permissions that you need to go through. Similarly, with data presented at a conference, obviously it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. It's common practice. Just make sure that you clearly state that the data or that an earlier version of the paper was presented at a conference. Now, preprint servers no longer are an issue for most journals. Again, you need to cite that original posting of your paper, and then let the editor know that a version of the paper can be found on a preprint server or in a repository, or whatever the case is, and make sure to provide a link to it. And most importantly, after your paper has been accepted and published, go back to that preprint server and put a link to the final version of record so people can find it. And lastly, originality issues. And these are also becoming much easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure instances of overlap with previously published work. So most of you will know that if you use someone else's ideas or processes or words or data, you need to clearly cite them and in the paper and provide a full reference to the work. This is true of all content. That means websites and blogs and such. What many are less aware of is the need to cite their own previously published work if you're using the same ideas in your current paper, because this will show up also on an originality check. Now, on the flip side of that, we are seeing a rise of text recycling, which is often called salami slicing. And this is when you use the same ideas or data or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or to the field. So just remember, anything you publish should be original content and pushing the research forward. So you really need to be honest with yourself. You know, if you've got one research project that should have led to 2 articles and you're trying to squeeze 4 out of them, you really need to be honest with yourself and ask yourself, is this actually adding anything new, or am I just trying to get another publication? Right. Once you're ready to submit, there are a few steps you should take. First of all, it's always a good idea to review what's already been published in your journal of choice. It's a good way to get a sense of whether or not your paper will fit well within the content there, but also you might find work that's relevant to your own. And I just want to go back to the comment I made earlier, that you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So if there is already a conversation going on in that journal that is related to your subject, it's important that you join that conversation if, again, relevant. So do cite work that is relevant to your paper, just so that the editor sees that you are a part of a larger conversation. And you want to make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal. So I have a little aims and scope statement there in the upper right-hand corner. These statements describe the journal's mission and the type of research they're interested in publishing. So this will tell you about the journal. And the editors spent a good deal of time crafting these statements. And their goal is to make sure that readers and librarians and authors understand exactly what the journal is about. And more importantly, one of the key reasons manuscripts are rejected is because the research doesn't fit within the scope of the journal. So you'll find this aims and scope statement on the journal website. It's usually on the landing page, or there might be a link to the aims and scope statement. Just for Taylor and Francis, it's just on the left-hand side there. And every journal will have one. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is make sure that you read and follow the instructions for authors. I've mentioned this a few times already. The instructions for authors are the rule books for the journal. So they will provide guidance on how to format your paper, on word counts. They'll provide information on any relevant charges like APCs, or if they have a page charge, or if they have a submission fee. So everything that you need to know about the journal and how you need to format your manuscript will be there. And just a quick word about language. I get this question quite a bit from authors. Should they send their paper out to a language editor before submitting? And I've asked a lot of editors this question, and most of them have said they're happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the argument and the methods that were used. So the language doesn't have to be picture perfect, but it does have to be understandable. Now, what I would suggest is do try and have as many of your colleagues as possible read your paper for fluency and just for the strength of your argument. And I would find those colleagues that are critical, not the ones that are just there to support you, but the ones that actually have the red pen that will rip your paper apart and help you improve it. And especially those who have experience in international publishing, because they will be able to bring that experience to looking at your paper. Now, if you do need language editing before you submit, many publishers like Taylor and Francis have editing services. You just need to check the website. You can find ours on our Author Services website. When you do submit your journal, more often than not, you will be submitting to an online submission system, such as ScholarOne or Editorial Manager. So to the right here, you can see the landing page for one of our ScholarOne sites. And in this example, someone has begun the submission process. And once you've submitted, you'll be able to follow the progress on the site. So you'll be able to see if it's out with reviewers or if it's come back into the editor and that sort of thing. I've also included a screenshot of our new submission portal, which most of our open access journals use on the left-hand side here. So this is an intuitive, kind of easy to use submission site that is linked or kind of overlaid onto our different peer review systems like ScholarOne and Editorial Manager. And as you can see here, you'll be asked to upload files, in this case, either by dragging or uploading the file directly from your computer. And then once they're uploaded, the files automatically are transferred onto the peer review system that the journal uses, and then the peer review process starts at that point. So before you begin the submission process, make sure to go in and familiarize yourself with the system that the journal uses and make sure you understand what's required in terms of documents and formatting and that sort of thing, because each journal tends to use a different system. So it's good to take that extra step. And here are some basic tips to keep in mind prior to submitting. First of all, as said, in most cases, you're submitting to an online system. So make sure that you have all of those files ready and on hand. And if you're using any images or data that's not yours, make sure that you've obtained permission. That's your responsibility, not the publisher's. And once again, I'll highlight this: to avoid any problems or mistakes, make sure you have an agreed upon plan with your co-authors on who's responsible for what, which journals you're submitting to, etc. And also make sure that you have their correct information. So the correct spelling of their name, how they want their name spelled, their current affiliation, their current email address, all that type of stuff. And lastly, I know this sounds a bit silly, but make sure that the version you submit is actually the final version of your paper. You don't want to go through peer review and wait for 3 months to have your paper rejected and then open up the file and realize you submitted the wrong version. So do take an extra 5 to 10 minutes to make sure that you have the right files, the most relevant files when submitting. Right, so now we're going to take a look at what peer review looks like in practice. And there are 3 different types of peer review you're likely to come across. The first one's called single blind peer review. And this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this type of peer review is most common within the STM, the science, technology, and medicine disciplines. The second type, double-blind peer review, is when all identities are hidden. And this is most common within arts and humanities and the social sciences. And then lastly, we have open peer review, and this is where all the identities are revealed. Everyone knows who everyone is. And what I would like to say about open peer review is that there are quite a few different varieties of open peer review. So it's important for you to go in and look and see how they practice peer review, because some of them are incredibly open, where people can see all of the different versions of the paper and the reviewer comments, and then some are just that the peer reviewer and authors both know who each other is. So make sure you understand what type of open peer review they are running. And here are the main roles that are involved in the peer review process. Obviously, it comes as no surprise, the editor is the key role. And the editor assesses the article to see if it's a good fit for the peer review in terms of content and quality. And if it is, then they will send it out to peer reviewers. Now, the editor also makes a decision based on the peer reviewer's comments. So the peer reviewers will give some suggestions to the editor on publication decision, and then the editor will make the ultimate decision on that. The peer reviewers, they read and assess the articles and the data included. Most journals have 2 to 3 external peer reviewers assess a manuscript. And they write a short report with suggested additions and changes for the author. And then, as said, they provide a recommendation to the editor regarding publication. And lastly, we have journal staff. And these folks are usually a part of the publishing house. And they are responsible for the systems that are used for running peer review. So they often do an initial check of the materials coming in. They also manage communications between peer reviewers and editors, and they are there to help if there are any technical difficulties with the website. So if you're having problems uploading files or something like that, they will step in and help you with that process. So as you can see, there's quite a few people involved in the assessment of one article. And here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. Your manuscript is submitted to the journal, and it goes through that initial check. And that check is to see that everything is in order. So if it's not formatted correctly, if that's an issue for a journal, or if it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to the author with instructions to reformat or update or include more material. And then once the files are in order, the submission is sent out to the editor for a quick review. And the editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to peer review at that point in time. Now, at this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope for the journal, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable, or if it's not understandable. And this is called a desk reject. However, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out to for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in the field. And they will read the work and provide a report for the editor with recommendations for a decision. And the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit with major revisions or with minor revisions. And the difference between these two is major revisions means that they like the idea or maybe they're intrigued with the data you're using, but there's still a lot of work to do. Major work to do, as the name indicates. Whereas minor revisions, it might mean that there's just 1 or 2 small changes that you need to do. Maybe some of your graphs need a bit of reworking, or maybe need to include a couple more citations or something like that. However, irrespective if it's major or minor, this means they're interested in your work. Again, they just have some suggestions on how you can make it even better. Now, your paper can also be rejected at this point, which comes as no surprise. I have also included except with a star here. Now, it is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it is highly unlikely. And I always tell the story of Eugene Fama, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. And I followed along to the Nobel lectures in Stockholm to hear him present the work that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And so the Nobel laureates usually present 1 or 2 papers that are based on that research. And he was presenting one of the papers, and at one point he stands back and he says, you know, I think that's one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So here's a man who's in his, I believe, his 70s, presenting a paper based on the research that led him to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And he's saying that's one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So that's just to say, get ready to revise. That's part of the game here. Every piece of writing can be improved upon. Now, once you make those revisions, you'll resubmit to the editor, who will either accept the paper at that point or send it out again to the reviewers to see if they're happy with the revisions or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through this cycle 2 to 3 times and still be rejected. And I'll tell you how to avoid that. Right. So responding to reviewers' comments in an appropriate manner is really important. But the first thing that I'd say is when you get the report back from the editor with the reviewer reports, especially if it's a major revision, it can feel a bit like a rejection and you might feel a bit down or disheartened. And if you're feeling that way, just close the computer and walk away for a couple of days. And then when you're ready to get to work, come back, open up the computer, and carefully read the letter that the editor sent along with the reviewer reports, because sometimes they'll have some guidance in there on how to deal with the reviewer comments, especially if the reviewers have conflicting comments, if they're disagreeing on points. They'll also have information about timelines for you, when you need to get your revisions back to them and that sort of thing. Now, if you do have co-authors, make an appointment with your co-authors, send them all the materials ahead of time, and sit down and go through all of the comments the reviewers have made. And basically what I would recommend is writing a to-do list, like writing down every recommendation they've made in a list, and you can group them by category if that's helpful, but you want to capture all of the recommendations that they've made. And then for those recommendations that seem reasonable, you can make those amendments in the paper. The most important thing that you do is that you need to address every single comment, every single recommendation the reviewers have made. This will help you avoid that fate of going through peer review a couple times and still being rejected. Now, when you send your new paper back to the editor with the revisions, you're going to accompany that with a letter with all of the changes that you have made or haven't made. So where you have amended the paper, you need to be clear on where that was in the paper, whether it's page number. You can also highlight or do track changes in your document, but you do want in that letter to note what you've added and where you've added it. And if you've decided not to take some of the recommendations that were made by the peer reviewers, you need to say why. You need to be very specific and you need to be respectful. So, you know, maybe they want you to rework some data, or maybe they want you to cite an author that you don't feel is aligned with your project. That's perfectly fine. You just need to be very clear about why you're not doing that, just so they understand. And as you're getting ready to send all those materials back to the editor, go through everything, make sure that to read the response to the editor for a couple things. Number one, make sure you've captured everything. Make sure it's clear, that it's understandable, to understand what you're talking about. And lastly, make sure that it's devoid of any frustration, because this can be a frustrating process and that can come out sometimes in the language that we use when we're responding to reviewer comments. The most important thing is really to be professional and to be respectful of the reviewers and the editor. This is your community that you're engaging with, and you want to make a good impression. You want to be collaborative because you might be collaborating with these people in the future. You might want to be on editorial boards that they're members of. So just really treat this as professionally as you can and with as much good humor as you can. And really try and keep in mind that the reviewers and the editors are really trying to help you publish your very best work. This is a gift, and it's a painful gift, but it is a gift, and it should be seen as such. Right, so everyone wants to know the top reasons for rejection. So I thought I would go through some of the reasons we've received from our editors over the years. And the first one, it will come as no surprise. I think I mentioned it earlier. The top reason for rejection is that the paper was sent to the wrong journal. So again, remember to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and look at what's previously been published to make sure that it's a good fit for your work. And number two, not a true journal article. And that comes back to what I said at the very beginning, understanding what sort of writing project you're undertaking and researching the best platform for your work. So it takes some time, but it's worth the effort. Number three is super easy. Too long, too short. That just means that you need to look at the instructions for authors and look at the word counts. They're always very specific. And I'm going to group 4 through 9 together because I think this really is about sharing your work as often as you can. So again, find those trusted colleagues to read and comment on your work. And again, find those colleagues that are critical, not the super nice ones that are just going to say, great. You want people to help you improve your paper. If you're worried about language, try to have a native English speaker take a look at your manuscript, or somebody who's very adept at the English language or who has published extensively in international journals, because they can, just read for fluency. And if you have the opportunity, try and present your work at international conferences or regional conferences so that you get outside of your bubble and you have people who aren't used to reading your work, hearing and reading your work for the first time, because you can kind of get a fresh perspective on how that work is translated. And lastly, one suggestion I would have is when I was in grad school, we had an interdisciplinary work group that would meet once a month, and we would read each other's papers and then comment on them once a month. And it was really useful because, number one, it was interdisciplinary. I'm a geographer, but it was people within politics and sociology and legal studies, etc. The other thing that was great about it, it included people at all stages of their career. So PhD students up to tenured professors who had, published numerous times. And it was really helpful because you could see that even those people that had extensive experience publishing still struggled with the process. Because let's be frank, writing is hard, communicating research is difficult. So it was really useful, and I recommend trying to build that kind of work group in your institution if you have an opportunity. It also helps to keep you on the ball with writing. If you know you have to share your work next month, you're going to finish that draft. Now, lastly, number 10, libelous, unethical, rude, or lacks objectivity. Obviously, avoid at all costs. Right, so what to do when your paper has been accepted? Well, obviously you celebrate, you've earned it. While getting published is a great accomplishment, no matter the stage of your career, it's especially true the first time. Make sure, especially if you haven't published in an open access journal, make sure to keep all the different versions of your paper. So the version that you submitted and the version that was accepted. You can post your accepted manuscript in an institutional repository after an embargo period. That's for subscription journals. Or you can also post those directly on your website. Now, publishers try their best to move manuscripts through the production process as quickly as possible, but much of it depends on the authors. So be sure to return your proofs by the suggested deadline to the production department. And those deadlines usually are pretty tight, so they'll give you about 3 days, but it's easy to go through the proofs, and it's becoming even easier in this day and age with all the technology. And if the production department has any questions for you, make sure to get back to them as quickly as possible as well. And lastly, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. That's what we're here for. It can be a confusing process. Every publisher works slightly differently. So if anything seems strange to you, just get in touch with the production department and they'll be able to help you. I just want to highlight a few simple ways that you can draw attention to your work. The first one is using your email signature. So, you know, with your email signature, you'll have all your contact information, and right under that, you can just put a line, you know, recent publications, and then put links to your most recent publication with just one line that describes what the paper's about. Really easy way to share your work. And then if you have a profile page on your institution's website, or if you have a personal web page, or if you're involved in any projects where there's a web page, make sure to include a link to your article on those sites as well. The more links there are to your article from a range of different websites, the higher up your article will land in any kind of search. And then also, if you are involved in any social networking sites, obviously use those as much as possible, and discussion lists as well, if you're on any listservs. And again, you just can post a short message. I've got a friend who's really great about saying, this might be of interest to you, and then posting a link of a new article on Facebook. And of course, his Facebook group is going to be people that are interested in new publications that he has. So they're going to click through and read. Great. Just before I finish today, I'd like to highlight a couple resources that you can explore on your own. The first one is How Researchers Change the World. And it's a podcast as well as a learning program, which is free to all. And every episode of the podcast features one researcher discussing a piece of research that has shaped the way we think today. So you'll hear the story behind the research directly from the researcher. So why the topic was important to investigate, how the research was developed, and how it's gone on to impact the world we live in. And then alongside the podcast, we've developed a 12-week learning program for researchers, both one for early career researchers and then one for mid-career researchers. And so the one for early career researchers takes a deep dive into the publishing process, and the one for mid-career researchers focuses more on how you can increase the impact of your work. So again, those are free resources that you can sign up for. And then lastly, just to highlight our author services website, which offers support and guidance and tips on everything from copyright to ethics to choosing a journal to tweeting about your research. On the website. So I encourage you to go explore that. And that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria. I have to say, the first comment that I'm seeing here is a comment from Vina, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, because she said, I like it how Victoria has managed to pack all this information into practical tips for us to understand the process. And it would be great if you could say thank you to her. And really, you have. As I've been looking at the questions, the next minute you've pretty much answered the question. So really, there is a lot of information in the slides and in the presentation that you've delivered. And for audience members, you will all receive Victoria's slides and a recording of this session, so you can look at this again. And of course, as she said, lots of these resources with Taylor and Francis as well are online, and she's hyperlinked all the relevant pages. Now, Victoria, if you don't mind, we have just maybe 2 or 3 questions. So a lot of the questions, as I've said, you've answered. There were a couple here that I thought were interesting. So there's a young man, I guess, Bobby Pratamapudra. He's a medical doctor. He just graduated. He currently doesn't have an affiliation with an institution, but he has articles ready to be published. Now, how important is it to have an affiliation in the publishing process?
Right. Well, first of all, congratulations. That's a big accomplishment. Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. Is affiliation a problem? And what I would say is if the research stands on its own, I mean, the research is a question. Is this relevant research? And they will assess it on that research alone. So I don't think it should be a blocker. Sometimes not having affiliation can be a blocker for funding if you're interested in publishing open access. Some of that funding might come from an affiliation from an institution, but it shouldn't be a complete blocker at all. The research should stand on its own. So if it's solid research, that should be enough there.
Thank you, Victoria. There's a lot of questions, again, how to identify a predatory journal from a legitimate journal. I mean, I know you've answered this. Maybe you can just quickly remind our viewers where they need to look and what sources they should, or resources they should look at.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem globally, and predatory publishers are pretty wily. I don't know if that's a word everyone knows, but they're quick. So once they're identified as a predatory publisher, they kind of shapeshift, you know, so they're constantly changing, they're constantly updating their websites. So there have been attempts to create both blacklists and whitelists for predatory publishers. So I know some institutions or some countries have tried to create whitelists, like India has recently put in a lot of resources toward whitelists. There have been blacklists, like the Beals list, which emerged a few years ago. But I think the resources that I mentioned are really probably the most dependable resources out there. So that was the DOAJ, and you'll see that on the slides that we share. This is a resource that's been around for a number of years. It was actually launched in Sweden. And a few years ago, they kicked all the journals off because they realized they were having a hard time monitoring some of those early journals that had been indexed there. So they kicked them all off and made everybody reapply, and they have very rigorous standards for acceptance for a journal to be included in their open access database. So that is a great resource. If the journal is relatively new, as I said, they might be going, you know, they might be going under evaluation, so it might not show. But then you just need to check out the publisher. Is this a legitimate publisher? And there you can go to OWASPA and look at their membership list. That should be really clear. The other thing is you can look at the website itself. What information are you finding on this website? Is there contact information? Does the website look a little bit dodgy? Like, is the information just slightly strange? Does it sound too good to be true? Like, peer review takes a day. Peer review does not take a day. You know, so it's just some of these common sense questions you need to ask yourself. And if you do take a look at that Think, Check, Submit site, I think it's got a lot of great basic questions just to have in your toolkit when you're assessing journals.
Thank you so much. We have a couple more questions. One person is asking, and this is Go Cheng Siu. So she or he says, your presentation indicates that we can post accepted manuscripts to repositories or websites. Is this appropriate with regards to the copyright concerns? To what extent can we post AM in the internet? I don't know what AM means.
I'm not sure either. EM?
AM. But anyhow, so is it possible to post accepted manuscripts to repositories and websites?
Yeah, so there's 3 different versions of your paper that you have. So you have the original paper that you submit, your Word or your LaTeX file, that you can post anywhere at any time. That's your version. And then the version that goes through peer review, so the accepted manuscript, the version that hasn't gone to production, it hasn't been typeset, that version you can submit to a repository. But if you published in a subscription-based journal, there's usually an embargo period. So for Taylor and Francis, our arts and humanities and social science journals have an 18-month embargo period. So you need to wait 18 months until you submit it to that repository. And then for STM, it's a little bit shorter. It's about 12 months for STM journals. So it's absolutely fine for you to submit after that embargo period, the accepted. Now the PDF can only live on the publisher's website or the society's website unless it's an open access journal. So that's where you get into copyright issues, is with that PDF version.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Gladys Wojciechowska. I know she's just about finishing her PhD because we had her in the session. She has a question regarding preprint repositories. She asks whether Taylor and Francis accepts papers that have been published in bioRxiv.
Yeah, so most of our journals do accept papers that have been posted on preprint servers. So I can't speak to other publishers, I can only speak to Taylor and Francis, but we do have a policy where those papers are acceptable. It's relatively new, as I think I mentioned that on one of the slides. People didn't know what to do with preprint servers previously, besides within mathematics, because they had had archive for a long time and that was natural. But in some of the other disciplines, they didn't know what to do with preprint servers, but it's become such a common practice that journals have adapted.
Great, thank you, Victoria. 2 more questions, one here. Someone is asking, when they're submitting a manuscript, is it necessary to include a cover letter, or do the editors actually not read this?
You know, there isn't a hard, fast rule for that. That's journal to journal. So some journals do request that you have a cover letter. So if you go to those instructions for authors, they'll usually say, this is what we expect people to do. I actually like letters to the cover letters, and even more so impact statements. Because they're slightly different than an abstract. An abstract says this is what the paper is about. An impact statement or a cover letter is saying why this research is important, why you should publish it, why people should read it. But again, it's just different depending on journals. So you just have to check that out on their site.
Okay, thank you. Then maybe a final question from someone called Mylatinova. So this person is right in the middle of the publishing process. They have they've submitted an article in the first quarter of the year, to a Q1 journal. The editor requested revisions twice, which the person complied with. Now they haven't heard for the past 2 months regarding the second revision. What should they do? When should they start getting worried and contacting the editor?
Yeah, I usually get the question about how long does peer review take? and I can tell you that from our perspective, we usually encourage our editors to get a first decision back to an author within 3 months. That's the goal. But keep in mind, we have everything from arts and humanities titles to medicine titles. So within arts and humanities, they tend to fall closer to the 3 month, whereas medicine tends to get, their decisions back a little bit quicker. That being said, I always say to folks that, the peer review process is a human process. They have to find peer reviewers, and then the peer reviewers themselves oftentimes don't meet the deadlines that were set for them. And that could be the case with your paper right now, that, basically the editor wanted the peer reviewers to take a look again, and maybe the peer reviewers that initially looked at your paper find themselves too busy to look at it this time. So then the editor needs to go out and find 1 or 2 more people to take a look at the paper. So there could be a delay there. But what I would say is, if you don't hear anything back in the next couple of weeks, it doesn't hurt to just politely check in with the editor. Can you give me a status update on my paper? Because sometimes that helps the editor. Then they can go back to the peer reviewers and saying, I've heard from the author, they're asking about the paper, can you give me an update? But yeah, I would probably check in with them a couple weeks from now.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, this is all that we have time for today. But again, there's so many very positive comments. Everybody is really thanking you, Victoria, for such a brilliant presentation and very, very practical advice for you, the early career researchers, to try and get your publications out there. Now, Victoria will send us the slides. We will share them with all of you, and please do make use of all the support that is available from Taylor and Francis, and of course other internet resources that you will find online. And Victoria, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
To have you on board again, and to everyone else, I wish you a wonderful evening and a great weekend ahead. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Good, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.